When I woke up in that dark vestry after my son's baptism, I saw my father-in-law's gold tie clip lying beside the sofa. In that moment, I understood that the man the whole town admired had stolen more than my dignity. He had transformed me into another person. What a joy to talk with you today. I'm Betty Anderson, 78 years well-lived, living here in Millfield, in rural Kentucky, land of warm weather and warm-hearted people. I was born in Springdale, also in Kentucky, but life brought me to this blessed town many years ago. These days, my greatest pleasure is watching women's volleyball on television. I never miss a game when our American team plays, you know? I sit here in my armchair, cheering as if I were there in the arena. The neighbors even joke that they can hear my cheers when the girls make a beautiful point. And you know what? I really do understand the game. I know all the rules. I know the players by name. I get anxious before competitions. I started liking volleyball after my Harold passed away. God rest his soul. It's been 15 years already. It was a way to occupy my mind, you know? At first, I watched anything that was on television, just to chase away the silence in the house. One day, I happened upon a Nations League transmission and was amazed by the strength of those young women. From then on, I never stopped. I even have a little notebook where I write down important games and results. My granddaughter Irene gave me a small radio as a gift, one of those battery-powered ones, so I can listen to the broadcasts when I'm in the backyard or when the power goes out. She says she's never seen a grandmother so fanatical about sports. But there's something about those girls playing that moves me, you know, seeing strong, determined women doing things that in my time we never imagined women could do. I'm sitting here on my porch where I spend my afternoons. I have a rocking chair that belonged to my mother, one of those old wicker ones, so comfortable that sometimes I doze off in it after lunch. From the porch, I can see the whole street, the children coming back from school, the activity at the corner bakery, and in the late afternoon when the sun is setting, the sky turns such a beautiful orange that it looks like a painting. Before I continue with my story, I'd like to ask you a favor. Click that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my stories. It really helps this grandma continue sharing what she's learned in life. And you, my dears who are watching now, tell me in the comments, from which little town are you watching me? And at what time of day did you find this video? Are you having your morning coffee, resting after lunch, or getting ready for bed? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and how you found time in your day to listen to this old lady tell her stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a network of affection. Today, I'm going to tell you a difficult story, but one that needs to be told. A story about how life can change in the blink of an eye and how I found strength to move forward when everything seemed lost. It's a story of pain, but also of rebirth. Because sometimes, my dears, we need to go through storms to see the rainbow that comes after. Remembering the past isn't always easy. There are things we keep in the bottom of our memory chest, things that hurt even after so much time. But there are also good memories, and it's with them that I begin to tell my story back in my girlhood days, when the world seemed a much simpler place. Childhood. I was born in 1947 in Springdale, in a simple but well-kept little house on Blossom Street. My father, Theodore Anderson, was a respected man throughout the town. He worked as an accountant at the only bank in town, and even without formal education, had a natural intelligence for numbers that impressed the educated doctors. He was a present father, the kind who came home from work and wanted to know how our day had been, who taught us our lessons, who told stories before bedtime. He had the patience of an angel, never raised his voice to any of the 5 children. Mama, Dorothy, was a teacher at the county school. A woman of fiber, raised on a farm, and who valued every educational opportunity she had. She always said, "Education is the only inheritance that no one can take from you." She would wake up while it was still dark to prepare breakfast for the family. Then she'd go teach, come back at lunchtime to cook for everyone, and still found time to help us with homework and do sewing work to supplement the household income. I don't know where she got so much energy. We were 5 siblings, me, the oldest, Then came Eugene, 2 years younger, then the twins Nancy and Nadine, and finally the baby, Oliver, who was born when I was already 9 years old. Our house was always full of laughter and movement. My brothers were my best friends and protectors. Eugene, even being younger, thought he was the guardian of his sisters. If any boy bothered us at school, he would go confront them, even though he was skinny and small for his age. The twins were inseparable and had their own language that only they understood. And Oliver, oh, he was the darling of the whole family, looked like a little doll. He was so beautiful, with golden curls and blue eyes he inherited from his Portuguese grandfather. Our house was simple, but very cozy. It had 3 bedrooms, one for my parents, one for the girls, and one for the boys. The kitchen was the heart of the home, with a wood stove that stayed lit all day in winter, warming the whole house and filling the air with the smell of good food. The backyard was large, with many fruit trees that my father cultivated with care. We had apple, peach, cherry, and even a small coffee plantation that he tended on weekends. Life in Springdale in the 50s was peaceful. The town was small, everyone knew each other. The streets weren't paved, and when it rained, they formed muddy puddles that for us, children, were the greatest fun, to Mama's despair, who had to wash all those mud-soaked clothes afterward. The games were simple: tops, marbles, jump rope, hopscotch, hide and seek. At night, especially in summer, families would put chairs on the sidewalk to chat, while we children played tag in the street, enjoying the cool air after a hot day. At school, I was diligent. I wasn't the smartest in the class, but I made an effort. Mama, being a teacher, demanded a lot from us. "A teacher's daughter can't get low grades," she would say. I loved Portuguese and history classes, but I struggled with math. Dad, with his skill with numbers, tried to help me, but I don't think I inherited that talent from him. My best friend was Zoe, the daughter of the pharmacy owner. We were inseparable. We went to school together, played together, dreamed together. We made plans for when we grew up. She would be a doctor, I would be a teacher like Mama. On weekends, when we didn't have school, we would go together to fetch water from the spring that was at the end of the street. It was a long walk, but we took advantage of it to chat, pick fruit along the way, watch the birds. The food at home was plentiful, thanks to the garden and orchard that Dad maintained. We ate very well: beans, rice, meat when possible, lots of vegetables and fruits. On Sundays, Mama would go all out and make fried chicken, gravy, mashed potatoes, a feast. And for dessert, there was always apple pie with cinnamon, her specialty that everyone in the neighborhood came to ask for the recipe. Our religious life was also important. We were practicing Baptists. Every Sunday, we went to service at the First Baptist Church, all dressed up in our best clothes. After the service, it was tradition to stop by Mr. Dominic's bakery to buy warm bread and corn muffins for the special Sunday breakfast. It was the only day that Dad didn't go to work and could have breakfast with us. During the 4th of July, the entire town would decorate, and each neighborhood had its own picnic and games. Mama would sew our holiday outfits with lots of ruffles and colorful ribbons. Dad helped organize the fireworks, always the most beautiful in the region. And there was lots of traditional food: corn pudding, corn on the cob, peach cobbler, apple pie. We ate until we couldn't eat anymore. It was a happy childhood, surrounded by love. Of course, we had financial difficulties at times. A teacher's and a banker's salary wasn't all that much. But we never lacked the essentials. And most importantly, we never lacked affection. Dad and Mom knew how to show love, even when they needed to be firm with us. When I was 11 years old, something happened that would change the course of our family. The bank where Dad worked decided to transfer him to the branch in Millfield, which was a larger town and was growing. It was a difficult decision for him and Mom to leave the town where they were born and had roots, but it was a promotion opportunity they couldn't refuse. I remember the day they told us we were going to move. We were all sitting at the dinner table when Dad gave the news. There was silence at first. Then came the questions, the tears, especially from the twins, who didn't want to leave their friends. I was also sad at the idea of separating from Zoe and from the school I knew so well. But Dad explained that it would be better for the family, that we would have more opportunities, a bigger house, better schools. The move was scheduled for the end of that year, after my siblings and I finished the school year. In the months leading up to it, it was a rush. Mama boxing up things from the house, Dad going back and forth to Millfield to organize our new home, us gradually saying goodbye to friends, neighbors, teachers. And so, at the end of 1958, we left Springdale for Millfield on a journey that seemed endless to an 11-year-old girl. A new chapter in our lives was about to begin, in an unknown town, but still together, united by the love of our family. Marriage. The arrival in Millfield was the beginning of a new life for our family. Dad soon established himself at the bank branch, and Mama got a position as a teacher at the county school. We adapted well to the larger town, which had paved streets, a movie theater, ice cream parlors. Things that for us, children coming from a small town, seemed like wonders. Our new house was on Jasmine Street, a quiet and tree-lined neighborhood. It was bigger than the one in Springdale, with an even more generous backyard where Dad continued his hobby of cultivating fruit trees. We even had a room just for the girls and another just for the boys, a luxury for us who had always shared tight spaces. The first years in Millfield were peaceful. I made new friends at school, especially with Dorothy, the baker's daughter, who became my companion for all hours. The twins soon got along with the neighborhood girls, and Eugene became the star of the school's football team. Oliver, still small, was the darling of all the teachers with his golden curls and sweet manner. It was during this time that I began to get interested in sports. The school had a physical education teacher, Miss Gina, who organized championships between the classes. I had never been very good at physical activities, but Miss Gina saw something in me and encouraged me to join the volleyball team. "Girl, you have height and agility. You'll be a great player," she would say. And that's how I discovered a passion that accompanies me to this day. Time passed, and before we knew it, we were completely integrated into Millfield life. Dad was promoted to bank manager, Mama became the school coordinator, and we, the children, were growing up healthy and happy. When I turned 15 in 1962, Dad organized a birthday party for me, something we had never done before due to financial issues. It was in the church hall, all decorated with flowers and colorful ribbons. I wore a light blue dress that Mama had sewn especially for the occasion. It was one of the happiest days of my life. The whole family gathered. My school friends, even some relatives from Springdale came to attend. At this party, I met Harold, nephew of Mrs. Eunice, the principal of the school where Mama worked. He had come from Nashville to spend the holidays with his aunt and ended up staying for the party. He was a handsome boy, athletic, studying accounting. We danced together to some songs, talked, and he seemed so kind, so polite. At the end of the night, he asked my father's permission to write me letters. That's how our long-distance courtship began. Letters went back and forth between Millfield and Nashville, full of youthful love promises and plans for the future. We met in person only during vacations, when he came to visit his aunt, or on special occasions, like Christmas or Easter. After 3 years of courtship like this, Harold graduated in accounting and got a job at the same bank where Dad worked, but at the Millfield branch. That's when our relationship intensified. He rented a room at Mrs. Zelda's boarding house and came to dinner at our house almost every day. Dad adored him, saw in him a hard-working and honest young man with a promising future. Mama also approved of him, always saying he had good manners and came from a proper family. In 1967, when I was 20 and Harold 23, he asked for my hand in marriage. It was on a Sunday night after family dinner. He had brought a small package, a simple engagement ring, but to me it was worth more than any expensive jewel. Dad gave his blessing immediately, and Mama cried with emotion. We set the wedding for the following year, enough time to prepare everything, and for Harold to get a promotion at the bank that would allow him to support a family. We got married in June 1968 in a simple ceremony at Millfield's First Baptist Church. We didn't have many resources for a big celebration, but it was all very beautiful and moving. Mama sewed my wedding dress. The twins were my bridesmaids, and Eugene was the best man along with Dorothy. Oliver, already 12 years old, carried the rings. It was a perfect day. We went to live in a small rented house near downtown, not too far from my parents' house. Harold continued at the bank, and I started giving tutoring lessons to neighborhood children to help with expenses. It was a simple life, but we were happy. In the first years of marriage, we took advantage of life as a couple, traveled a bit around Kentucky, got to know new places. In 1970, I got pregnant with our first child. The pregnancy was smooth, and in May 1971, our Gerald was born, a strong and healthy boy, the spitting image of his father. Harold proved to be a dedicated father from the first moment, changing diapers, giving baths, helping with everything, something rare for men of that time. My parents were delighted with their grandson, and my sisters took turns coming to help in the first months. 2 years later, in 1973, came our Helen, a beautiful girl with green eyes like my maternal grandmother. And in 1975, we completed our family with the birth of Matthew, our baby. Life followed its normal course, with the joys and challenges of raising 3 small children. Harold had been promoted to assistant manager at the bank, which improved our financial situation. We managed to buy our own house, bigger, with a yard for the children to play. I went back to giving tutoring lessons when Matthew turned 2. In 1979, strange things started happening. Harold spent more time away from home, said they were work demands, meetings that extended into the night. Sometimes he came home smelling of alcohol, something that had never been common before. When I questioned, he would get irritated, say I didn't trust him, that I was imagining things. In early 1980, Harold suddenly became very ill. A high fever that wouldn't break, persistent cough. The doctor diagnosed severe pneumonia, and he needed to be hospitalized. I was desperate, with 3 small children to care for and my husband in the hospital. My parents were fundamental at this moment, helping with the children while I alternated between home and hospital. It was during this hospitalization that we met Ernest, Harold's father. They didn't have much contact. Harold had been raised by his mother after his parents separated when he was still a child. Ernest found out about the hospitalization by chance through a mutual acquaintance and showed up at the hospital bringing flowers and offering help. At first, I was wary. Harold always spoke little of his father, and what little he said wasn't positive. But Ernest proved so solicitous, so concerned about his son, that I gradually let my guard down. He was an elegant man, in his 60s, well-dressed, soft-spoken, and educated. He owned a small transportation company in Millfield and lived alone since his second wife had passed away a few years before. During Harold's hospitalization, which lasted almost a month, Ernest became a constant presence. He brought food for me at the hospital, picked up the children from school when my parents couldn't, helped financially with the cost of medicines. "It's the least I can do to make up for the years of absence," he would say. When Harold was discharged, still very weak, Ernest offered his house for the convalescence. It was larger, airier, and he had a maid who could help with the care. After some hesitation, Harold accepted. I think deep down, he wanted this rapprochement with his father, this chance to heal old wounds. We moved temporarily to Ernest's house, me, Harold, and the 3 children. At first it was strange, but we soon adapted. The children adored the grandfather they had just met, especially because he spoiled them with presents and treats. Harold seemed happy with the reconciliation, and I felt relieved to have help in caring for my still convalescent husband. That's when I began to notice some strange things. Ernest always seemed to find reasons to be alone with me, when Harold was resting or when the children were at school. At first it was just compliments. "My son is lucky to have such a dedicated wife. How good that he found such a beautiful and caring woman." But gradually, the comments became more personal, more invasive. Once, while I was washing the lunch dishes, he approached from behind and said in my ear, "If I had a woman like you, I would never have left my family." I felt a shiver down my spine, but tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just a lonely man in need of affection. Another day, he entered the room where I was changing, without knocking. I pretended not to notice his lingering gaze as I hurried to put on my robe. "Oh, sorry, I thought it was Harold's room," he said, but didn't leave immediately, as would be natural. I began to feel uncomfortable, but didn't know how to approach the subject with Harold, who seemed so happy with the rapprochement with his father. I didn't want to be responsible for creating a new estrangement between them. Besides, part of me doubted my own perceptions. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe they were just the manners of a man from another generation. The situation worsened when Harold returned to work, albeit part-time. Ernest began to make more direct insinuations, to touch my arm or my back accidentally when he passed by me, to make comments about how Harold didn't give me the value I deserved. One afternoon, while the children were at school and Harold at the bank, Ernest cornered me in the kitchen. "A woman like you needs a man who knows how to truly appreciate her," he said, trying to forcibly kiss me. I managed to push him away and ran to the room, locking the door. I stayed there, trembling, until I heard his car leaving the garage. That night, I told everything to Harold. I expected support, indignation, protection, but his reaction left me perplexed. First, he doubted my story. My father would never do something like that. Then he insinuated that I might have given reasons. "You've been dressing in a way that draws attention." Finally, he asked me not to make a fuss. "We've finally reconciled. Don't ruin it with silly jealousy." It was like a slap in the face. The man I knew, whom I loved, seemed to have been replaced by a stranger. I decided then that we needed to return to our house as soon as possible, reconciliation or not. I told Harold that the children missed their own space, that he was well enough to return home, that we had already abused Ernest's hospitality too much. After some resistance, Harold agreed, and we returned to our house the following week. I thought this would solve the problem, that it would put enough distance between me and Ernest. But I was wrong. Ernest began to show up at our house unannounced, always bringing presents for the children, always finding excuses to stay when Harold wasn't around. I started locking myself in the bedroom with the children when I knew he would come. I avoided answering the door or the phone, but Millfield was a small town, and we crossed paths in the streets, at the market, at church. On one of these occasions, in the market parking lot, he approached me while I was putting groceries in the car and said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "You can run as much as you want, my dear, but I am a patient man, and I always get what I want." That's when I really felt fear. He wasn't just a lonely old man with inappropriate desires. There was something calculating, almost predatory in the way he looked at me, as if I were prey and he was just waiting for the right moment to attack. I tried to talk to Harold again, but he remained blind to his father's true nature. "You're obsessive about this," he would say. "My father is just trying to be kind, make up for lost time with the family." With each of these conversations, I felt a greater distance growing between us. The assault in 1981, Matthew turned 6, and Ernest insisted on organizing a big birthday party for his grandson. Harold was excited about the idea. His father had connections in town. He could make a much more lavish celebration than we could with our limited resources. Reluctantly, I gave in, thinking of the children, of how happy they would be with a nice party. The party was at the town club, with clowns, a 3-tiered cake, expensive presents for Matthew, and luxurious party favors for the guests. Ernest made a point of inviting important people from Millfield, the mayor, councilmen, businessmen. It was as if he wanted to show his power, his influence. Throughout the party, he stayed by my side, introducing me to the guests as my dear daughter-in-law, always with his hand on my shoulder or waist, in a gesture that to others might seem affectionate, but that made me feel possessed. That night, after the children went to bed exhausted from the party, Harold surprised me with news. His father had offered a partnership in the transportation business, and he was considering leaving the bank to accept the offer. "It's a unique opportunity," he argued. "We could make a lot more money, give the children a better life." I felt a knot in my stomach. It was the last thing I wanted, Harold working side by side with Ernest every day, falling even more under his influence. I tried to argue, talk about the risks of leaving a stable job at the bank, his inexperience in the transportation industry. But Harold was decided. The following month, he resigned from the bank and started working with his father. In the first months, it seemed to work well. Harold would come home excited, talking about new contracts, expansion plans. Ernest maintained a respectful distance from me when we were in public or when Harold was around. I began to think that maybe he had given up, or that maybe I had really exaggerated in my perceptions. But then things started to change. Harold began to arrive home later and later, always with excuses about business meetings that ran long. When I questioned, he would get irritated, defensive. The money, which at first was abundant, began to become scarce. When I asked about finances, I received vague answers about investments and tough times in the sector. That's when Helen started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, saying there was a scary man in her room. I tried to calm her, saying it was just a dream, but she insisted, with eyes wide with fear, "He stands watching me, Mommy. He stands at the door, watching me." I began to suspect. I started to religiously lock the doors and windows before going to bed. I put a chair against the doorknob of the children's room. But Helen's nightmares continued, and now Gerald was also saying he felt afraid during the night. One night, I woke up to a noise in the kitchen. Harold had gone out to a business meeting and had not yet returned. I grabbed the bedside lamp, the only weapon I had at hand, and went down the stairs silently. There was no one in the kitchen, but the back door was ajar when I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. The next day, I confronted Harold. He laughed at my concern. "You're becoming paranoid," he said. "You probably forgot to lock the door, that's all." But I knew I hadn't forgotten. Something was wrong, very wrong, and I was beginning to feel that I was alone in this perception. Things came to a head when, in August 1982, Helen and Matthew were baptized. Until then, with our busy life, only Gerald had been baptized as a baby. The pastor suggested we have the baptism for the other two children, and Ernest immediately offered to be the godfather to both and to organize the celebration. Harold was radiant with the idea, seeing it as another sign of full reconciliation with his father. I resisted. I didn't want Ernest even more intertwined in our lives, with the spiritual authority of godfather over my children. But, as always, I was outvoted. Ernest turned the baptism into a grandiose event. He rented the church hall, hired catering, luxurious decoration, even a small orchestra to play during the reception. He invited the entire town, once again showing his power and influence. At church, he held Helen and Matthew as if they were his own children, receiving the congratulations from the guests with a proud smile. During the party that followed in the church hall, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. There was something in the air, a tension that I couldn't name. Ernest was everywhere, always being the perfect host, always finding a reason to be close to me. At one point, when I was sitting alone at a distant table, watching the children play, Ernest approached with a glass of water. "You look tired, my dear. You need to hydrate after so much emotion." There was something in his look, an intensity that made me hesitate. But we were in public, surrounded by people, in God's house. What harm could there be in accepting a glass of water? I drank the liquid in small sips while he stood there, watching me with a strange smile. A few minutes later, I began to feel dizzy, a drowsiness that made no sense. I tried to stand up, but my legs seemed made of cotton. I saw Harold approach, concerned, and vaguely heard Ernest say, "She must be exhausted, poor thing. So many emotions today." Let me take her to rest a bit in the vestry. She needs quiet. I tried to protest, to say I didn't want to go with him, but my voice wouldn't come out. I felt his strong arm supporting me, guiding me away from the hall, away from people, away from safety. The world around me was spinning, the images becoming blurred. I vaguely remember being placed on an old sofa in a dark and silent environment. I remember the strong smell of his expensive cologne, the sensation of his hands on my body, of his weight upon me. I remember wanting to scream, wanting to push him away, but my body didn't respond to my brain's commands. It was like being trapped inside myself, conscious but helpless. When I woke up hours later, I was alone in the dark and empty vestry. The party was over. My body ached, my clothes were in disarray, and the fragmented memory of the horror began to solidify in my mind. As I got up, trembling, I saw something shining on the floor beside the sofa. Ernest's gold tie clip, with his initials engraved, which must have fallen during that. That small metal object became the proof of what had happened. The shock and confusion gave way to cold fury, to absolute certainty. I took the clip, squeezed it in my hand until I felt its edges marking my palm, and left the church with a single certainty: this would not go unpunished. Aftermath. I left the church that night with the tie clip clutched in my hand, as if it were a burning coal. My mind was a confusion of thoughts, emotions, and fragments of memory that I couldn't put in order. I walked aimlessly through the streets of Millfield, not even noticing where I was going, until I found myself in the central square, sitting on a bench, trembling despite the heat of the Kentucky night. What to do now? Who to turn to? How to go back home and face Harold, the children? How to explain where I had been, what had happened? The shame consumed me, though my reason knew I was the victim, not the guilty one. But in 1982, in a small town, a woman who accused a powerful man like Ernest would be looked at with distrust, with suspicion. His word against mine, and he had influence, money, respect in the community. After hours sitting on that bench, gathering courage, I returned home. Harold was in the living room, pacing back and forth, visibly distressed. When he saw me, he came running in my direction. "Where were you? We were worried. My father said he left you resting in the vestry, but when we went to get you, you had disappeared." The mention of Ernest made my stomach turn. I tried to control my trembling voice. I needed fresh air, went out for a walk. Harold looked at me strangely. "Without telling anyone?" "The children were asking for you. I had to ask my father to bring them home." The thought of Ernest alone with my children made my blood freeze. "Where are they?" "Sleeping." They were exhausted from the party. I ran to the children's room, needing to see them, to make sure they were okay. They slept peacefully in their beds. I stayed there, watching them breathe, feeling a mixture of relief and deep fear. When I returned to the living room, Harold was waiting for me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "What's happening to you, Betty? You've been acting so strange lately." It was time to tell. I took a deep breath, sat down in front of him, and began. "Harold, I have something very serious to talk about. It's about your father." I told everything, from the first approaches when we were at Ernest's house, the insinuations, the attempts to touch me, to what happened in the vestry that night. I showed the tie clip as proof. Harold's reaction was worse than I could have imagined. At first, he just looked at me in silence. Then he began to laugh, a dry, incredulous laugh. "Have you gone crazy? My father, the man who helped us when I was sick, who gave a wonderful party for our children?" "It's true, Harold. Why would I make up something like this?" His face transformed, the incredulity giving way to anger. "Maybe because you're jealous of my relationship with my father. Maybe because you can't stand that he's successful and generous while your parents can barely help us financially." That hit me like a slap. I never imagined Harold could say something so cruel about my parents, who had always supported us as best they could. "How can you say that? My parents have always been by our side." "But they can't give us what my father can they?" A better life, opportunities, connections. Is that what matters to you? His money? His connections? Harold took the clip from my hand and examined it. This doesn't prove anything. He probably lost it when he was helping you go to the vestry since you were feeling ill. I wasn't feeling ill. He put something in my drink. Now you're being ridiculous. He threw the clip on the table. Tomorrow I'm going to return this to my father and apologize for your absurd accusation. I tried once more. Harold, please, believe me. Why would I lie about something so serious? He looked at me coldly. I don't know what's going through your head, Betty. But I suggest you think carefully before spreading these slanders about my father. He may not be as understanding as I'm being. That night, I slept in the children's room, unable to lie beside the man I once thought I knew so well. I didn't sleep. I lay looking at the ceiling, trying to understand how my life had crumbled so quickly and what I would do now. The next morning, Harold had already left when I woke up. On the kitchen table, a note. Went to work. Hope you're calmer today. Dad will come for lunch so we can talk. Panic took hold of me. Ernest would come to my house. He would be alone with me again. And now, knowing Harold didn't believe me, he would feel even more encouraged, more unpunished. I couldn't allow this. I called my mother, asking if I could come for lunch and bring the children. I made up an excuse about wanting them to spend more time with the grandparents. Mom, always perceptive, noticed something in my voice. Betty, is everything okay? You sound distressed. Everything's fine, Mom. I just need to get out of the house today. I spent the day at my parents' house, trying to act normally so as not to worry them and not raise suspicions in the children. But my father, always observant, called me to talk while Mom was distracting the children in the backyard. Daughter, you're not well. What happened? I wanted to tell everything, to unburden myself, to ask for help. But how to explain something so horrible to my father? How to make him understand that the man he respected, his daughter's father-in-law, had done something so abominable? And what could my father do? Confronting Ernest would be dangerous. He was powerful, had connections. He could harm my father at the bank, ruin his reputation. I'm just tired, Dad. A lot of rushing around with the baptism party yesterday. He didn't insist, but I saw in his eyes that he wasn't convinced. I returned home late, hoping that Harold had already returned from work and that Ernest had gone. But I found the two sitting in the living room waiting for me. Ernest's look chilled me to the bone. There was something triumphant about it, like a predator who knows he has cornered his prey. "Where have you been all day?" asked Harold, with a coldness he had never directed at me before. "At my parents' house, with the children. I left a message with Mrs. Zelda at the bakery, to let you know if you passed by there." "We were worried," said Ernest, with false solicitude. "After your strange behavior last night, we were concerned that something might have happened." I had to use all my strength not to scream, not to accuse him right there. But the children were in the room, and I didn't know what Harold or Ernest would be capable of if I made a scene. "I'm fine. I just needed to visit my parents." Harold stood up. "Betty, my father, and I talked. He is deeply hurt by your insinuations. He said he has always treated you like a daughter and doesn't understand why you would make up something like this." "I didn't make up anything," I replied, keeping my voice low but firm. Ernest intervened, with his smooth and reasonable voice, which I now realized was his most effective mask. "My dear, I understand you must be going through some difficult moment. Perhaps stress with the children, with the house. Harold told me you've been nervous, imagining things. Have you thought about consulting a doctor?" That was his strategy, to make me appear unbalanced, hysterical, a tactic as old as it was effective for discrediting women. "I'm not imagining things. I know exactly what happened." Harold let out an exasperated sigh. "Dad came here, despite your absurd accusations, to try to help. He suggested we pay for a doctor, a specialist in Nashville, to take care of you." "I don't need any doctor. "See how agitated she is?" Ernest said to Harold, as if I weren't present. "This isn't normal. It could be something serious, son." The conversation continued in this tone for some time, the two men discussing my supposed mental condition, ignoring my protests, treating me like a capricious child or a raving lunatic. Finally, exhausted and realizing I wouldn't get anywhere, I said I was going to bed. Harold came to the bedroom later. He didn't touch me, didn't lie down beside me. He stood at the door as if afraid to approach. "Dad thinks you need professional help." And I agree. "If you don't accept seeing a doctor, I'll have to take more serious measures." "What kind of measures?" I asked, fear growing in my chest. "There are places for people with mental problems, Betty. I don't want to get to that point, but if you continue with these stories about my father, insisting on these lies..." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I realized with horror that Harold, manipulated by Ernest, would be capable of having me committed, of separating me from my children, all to protect his father and the image of the perfect family that Ernest had built. In the days that followed, I lived in a constant state of tension and fear. Harold watched me constantly, reporting every strange behavior to Ernest. The father-in-law, in turn, began to frequent our house even more, always solicitous, always playing the role of the concerned father and grandfather, and always finding moments to be alone with me, to whisper veiled threats while maintaining that affable smile for others. "No one would believe you against me," he would say, when no one could hear. "I have the mayor, the sheriff, the judge, all on my payroll. Try anything, and it will be you who ends up locked away, far from your children." Ernest also began to take Harold and the children on outings, leaving me at home, to rest, as he would tell others. It was his way of showing that he could distance my family from me whenever he wanted, that he had more power over them than I did. I tried to turn to my parents again, telling part of the truth, that Harold and his father-in-law were threatening me, that they feared for my mental well-being, that they talked about having me committed. I didn't have the courage to reveal the abuse, but hoped this would be enough to get help. My father was outraged, but also concerned. "This is very serious, Betty. Ernest has influence in this town. If he convinces a doctor to sign a report..." "What can I do, Dad?" He thought long and hard. "Maybe it would be better for you and the children to come stay with us for a while, until this situation calms down." But when I tried to leave the house with the children the next day, Harold unexpectedly appeared from work. He saw the small suitcases I had prepared and exploded. "Where do you think you're going? Going to take my children without my permission?" "We're just going to spend a few days with my parents. The children miss them." "Lie! You're running away, aren't you? After all your crazy stories about my father, now you want to disappear with my children?" The argument escalated quickly. Harold shouted. I tried to stay calm so as not to frighten the children, who were watching everything with wide eyes full of fear. At one point, he grabbed my arm forcefully, leaving purple marks that would last for days. "You're not going anywhere, and you're certainly not taking my children." It was Gerald, only 11 years old, who intervened. "Stop, Dad! You're hurting Mom!" Harold seemed to wake from a trance, looking at his own hand still tight on my arm. He released me slowly, but his look was still hard. "Nobody leaves this house. Are we understood?" That night, Harold called Ernest, telling him what had happened. The next day, my father-in-law showed up with a man he introduced as Dr. Gilbert, a specialist in nervous diseases from Nashville, who was, coincidentally, in Millfield. The doctor asked me invasive questions about my thoughts, my delusions about Ernest, my attempt to flee with the children. No matter what I answered, it was clear he already had a diagnosis ready, commissioned and paid for by Ernest. "She needs treatment," he finally said to Harold, as if I weren't in the room. "She's suffering from hysteria, possibly with persecutory delusions. I have a clinic in Nashville where we could take proper care of her." "I'm not going to any clinic," I protested, panic taking over me. "See how agitated she is?" observed the doctor. It's typical of these cases. The resistance to treatment is part of the clinical picture. Harold seemed genuinely distressed, torn between loyalty to his father and some remnant of love for me. Isn't there another option? Medications she can take at home? Dr. Gilbert seemed reluctant, but agreed to prescribe some medicines to calm the nerves. He handed Harold a bottle of pills with explicit instructions. 3 a day, and make sure she takes them. I'll return in a week to evaluate if it's working. If there's no improvement, we'll have to consider hospitalization. After they left, Harold handed me the first pill with a glass of water. Take it. It's for your own good. I looked at that small white pill, feeling it was another trap, another way to control me, to silence me. But what could I do? If I refused, it would be another proof of my instability, another reason to separate me from my children. I put the pill in my mouth, drank the water, but as soon as Harold turned around, I hid the pill under my tongue and then spat it out when I went to the bathroom. I would have to continue with this charade, pretend I was taking the medication, pretend I was improving, while looking for a way to escape this situation. The days that followed were a nightmare of constant surveillance. Harold began to work more from home, leaving only when Ernest came to take care of me. The children were instructed to report any strange behavior of mine. My parents, when they tried to visit me, were met with excuses. I was resting, I was indisposed, the doctor had recommended absolute rest. I was becoming a prisoner in my own home, isolated from any external support, constantly watched, threatened with separation from my children if I didn't behave properly, which meant accepting Ernest's abuses in silence, pretending nothing had happened, taking the medications that would leave me doped and vulnerable. Ernest, in turn, became increasingly bold. He would show up when Harold wasn't around, enter my room without knocking, make comments about my body in front of the children, all in a subtle enough way that, if I protested, it would seem like another imagination of mine. One afternoon, while I was preparing lunch and the children were at school, he arrived unannounced. He entered the kitchen with that confident walk of someone who feels like the owner of the place. And in a way, he was. He had taken possession of my house, my family, my life. "My dear daughter-in-law," he said, approaching from behind while I was cutting vegetables. "Always so dedicated, such a good housewife." His hands landed on my shoulders, slowly descending along my arms. I felt his hot breath on my neck. "You know, everything would be much easier if you cooperated. Harold wouldn't need to know anything. The children would have a comfortable life. You would have everything you wanted." I gripped the knife in my hand, feeling a hatred I had never experienced before. For a moment, just a moment, I considered turning quickly and ending it all. But the image of my children stopped me. What would become of them if I went to prison? They would be under Harold and Ernest's guardianship. The idea was unbearable. Instead, I kept calm, took a deep breath and said with the firmest voice I could muster, "Take your hands off me. Now." He laughed, that soft and controlled laugh that I had learned to hate. "Or what? You'll scream? Call your husband? No one would believe you, dear, especially now that everyone knows about your mental problems." At that moment, the front door opened. It was Helen, coming home early from school because she had felt ill. Ernest quickly moved away, composing his mask of affectionate grandfather. "My little granddaughter, what happened? Not feeling well?" Helen, at 9 years old, looked from Ernest to me, seeming to feel the tension in the air despite the forced smiles. "I have a headache," she said hesitantly. "Come here, let Grandpa take care of you." He extended his arms, but Helen backed away, coming to my side. "I want Mommy," she said, clinging to my skirt. I saw a flash of irritation in Ernest's eyes, quickly replaced by feigned concern. Of course. Your mother knows better how to handle these girl things." He turned to me. "Well, I'll be going then. Tell Harold I stopped by. And Betty, Think about what we discussed. After he left, Helen looked at me with eyes too serious for a child her age. Mom, did Grandpa do something to you? The question caught me by surprise. Why are you asking that, honey? Because you act different when he's around. You get scared, and I don't like it when he hugs me either. He squeezes too tight and stays too long. I felt my heart tighten. What was Helen telling me? Had Ernest done something to my daughter too? The possibility was so horrible I could barely breathe. Helen, has he ever done anything that made you uncomfortable? Anything you didn't like? She lowered her eyes. He looks at me in a weird way when Daddy isn't around. And sometimes when he hugs me, his hands are in places that make me feel strange. At that moment, something inside me broke and was reforged at the same time. The fear I felt for myself transformed into a protective fury for my children. I could endure what Ernest had done to me, but the idea that he might do the same to Helen or to any of my children was simply intolerable. Helen, listen to me carefully, I said, kneeling to be at the level of her eyes. If Grandpa or anyone tries to touch you in a way you don't like, you scream really loud and run. Understand? And always, always tell me. She nodded, serious. Okay, Mom. I hugged her tightly, feeling tears burning my eyes. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't submit to this situation in the hope that something would change. I needed to act, and it needed to be now. That very night, while Harold was taking a shower, I secretly took the phone and called my father. I spoke quickly, in a low voice. Dad, I need your help. Urgent. It's about the children. Ernest. I couldn't finish the sentence. My father, always so calm, sounded alarmed. What did he do, Betty? I can't talk now, but please come pick me up tomorrow morning. Say the bank is calling Harold for an urgent meeting, that it can only be with him. Betty, you're scaring me. Please, Dad, trust me. It's a matter of life and death. There was a moment of silence, and then my father said, firmly, I'll be there at 8 in the morning. I hung up quickly upon hearing the shower being turned off. Harold couldn't know about this conversation, couldn't suspect anything. That night was the longest of my life. Lying beside Harold, unable to sleep, I planned every detail of the next day. It would have to be quick, precise. There would be no second chance. Escape. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose. I had slept little, but was alert, with every nerve in my body tense like a violin string. I got up silently, prepared breakfast, and got the children ready for school like any normal day. Harold seemed suspicious of my apparent calm, but didn't say anything. When the clock struck 8, I heard the honk of my father's car in front of the house. Harold was already dressed for work, waiting for Ernest, who would come pick him up as he did every day. Who's honking at this hour? He asked irritably, going to the window. Seeing my father, his expression changed to surprise. What is your father doing here? I don't know, I lied. I'll see what he wants. I opened the door and my father entered, with a serious expression he rarely showed. Good morning, Harold. I came to pick you up for an urgent meeting at the bank. The regional manager is in town and wants to talk to you about that problem with your resignation. Harold frowned, confused. What problem? My resignation was processed correctly. It seems there was an error in calculating the severance pay. You better go there in person to resolve this. It could be a good amount. I saw the hesitation on Harold's face. Money was always a weak spot for him, especially after he started working with his father and the family finances became unstable. And why did you come to get me? My father should be arriving to go to the office. The meeting is at 8:30. There's no time to wait for your father. The regional manager will only be at the branch until 10 a.m., then he goes on to Louisville. Harold still seemed uncertain, but the prospect of receiving extra money spoke louder. All right, let me get my documents. While he went back to the bedroom, I exchanged a quick glance with my father, who nodded discreetly. The plan was working. As soon as Harold left with my father, I began to act quickly. I had prepared small suitcases for me and the children the night before, hidden in the back of the yard shed. Gerald, who at 11 years old already understood a bit of the gravity of the situation, helped me carry the suitcases to my brother Eugene's pickup truck, which was waiting a block away, as we had arranged. Helen and Matthew were scared and confused, but obedient. "We're going to take a surprise trip, my loves," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm despite my racing heart. "We're going to spend a few days at Grandma Dorothy's house." While Eugene drove to the bus station, I constantly looked in the rearview mirror, fearing to see Ernest's car following us. But the streets of Millfield were quiet that morning, with no sign of pursuit. At the bus station, my mother was waiting for us with tickets already purchased to Nashville. "Are you sure about this, daughter?" she asked, concern evident in her tired eyes. "I am, Mom. I can't continue like this. I can't let him do this to my children." I didn't need to explain who he was or what this meant. My mother, with that intuition that only mothers have, seemed to understand even without words. The bus would leave in 20 minutes. Eugene promised to stay at the station until we boarded, to ensure our safety. While we waited, the minutes seemed to drag on. Each person who entered the station made me start, imagining it was Ernest or one of his henchmen. That's when I saw Ernest's car parking in front of the station through the glass window. My blood froze. "He's here," I whispered to Eugene, who immediately became alert. "Stay with the children in the women's restroom," he instructed. "I'll distract him." I took Helen and Matthew by the hands, while Gerald followed us closely, and we hid in the women's restroom at the station. Through the small window, I saw Eugene approaching Ernest, who seemed furious, gesticulating and shouting something I couldn't hear. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The children, sensing my fear, remained silent, eyes wide and frightened. Finally, I heard the announcement of our bus. We needed to leave the restroom and board, but Ernest could still be out there. That's when my mother entered the restroom. "Come quick. Your brother is distracting Ernest on the other side of the station. We have to run." With my heart in my throat, I took the children and we left the restroom. Mom led us through an alternative path, passing through the cargo area to the platform where our bus was waiting. We boarded hurriedly, and only when the bus started moving did I allow myself to breathe. Looking through the window, I saw Ernest running toward the bus, shouting and gesticulating, but it was too late. We were on our way to Nashville, away from him, away from Harold, away from that nightmare. But I knew that escape was just the beginning. Ernest was a powerful man, with connections in many places. He wouldn't give up easily, and Harold, manipulated by his father, would certainly accuse me of kidnapping the children. During the journey, while the children finally slept, exhausted by the tension and excitement, I planned my next steps. In Nashville, we would initially stay at my Aunt Norma's house, my mother's sister, who lived in a remote neighborhood where it would be difficult to find us. From there, I would seek legal help and try to build a new life for me and my children. What I didn't expect was the violence of Ernest's reaction. The day after our escape, he invaded my parents' house in Millfield, threatening them and demanding to know our whereabouts. Fortunately, my father had already anticipated this and was with 2 police friends when Ernest arrived. The father-in-law was forced to leave, but not without making terrible threats. "You'll regret this, Theodore," he shouted from the sidewalk as he was escorted out. "No one takes my grandchildren from me. No one." By phone, I learned that Harold was devastated by my betrayal, as he called it. He firmly believed that I had gone crazy, that I had made up stories about his father, and now had kidnapped his children. He filed a petition for search and seizure of the children, alleging that I was mentally unstable and posed a danger to them. It was the darkest moment of my life. Alone in a big city, with 3 small children to support, being hunted by the man who raped me, and by the husband who chose to believe him instead of me. There were nights when I cried until I had no more tears, questioning whether I had made the right choice, whether I shouldn't have endured a little more, swallowed my pain, and stayed silent for the sake of the children. But then I remembered the look in Helen's eyes when she talked about her grandfather, remembered Ernest's hands on my body, remembered the threats to have me committed, and knew there was no other way. The turning point came from where I least expected. Mrs. Zelda, the owner of the boarding house where Harold had lived when he arrived in Millfield, was known for her discretion and kindness. She had witnessed my growing desperation in recent months, had seen the changes in Harold, had observed Ernest's behavior. And more importantly, she had a niece who worked as a maid in Ernest's house and who, over the years, had witnessed disturbing behaviors from him with other women and girls. It was Mrs. Zelda who, risking a lot, traveled to Nashville to find me and put me in contact with her niece Nancy. And it was Nancy who, overcoming the fear of losing her job and possibly much more, agreed to testify against Ernest. With this unexpected support, I sought out a lawyer specializing in women's rights, Dr. Arliss, recommended by a support group for women victims of violence in Nashville. He listened to my story with attention and respect, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. "What you describe is a classic case of abuse of power and manipulation," he said, after hearing my complete account. "Unfortunately, it's very common in situations where there's a great difference in power and influence. But with Nancy's testimony and the evidence we have, like the tie clip, we can build a strong case." Under Dr. Arliss's guidance, I filed a lawsuit against Ernest for sexual assault and against Harold for negligence and psychological abuse. I also requested full custody of the children, with supervised visitation rights for Harold after psychological evaluation. The months that followed were an exhausting legal battle. Ernest used all his influence to try to discredit me, hiring the best lawyers, spreading rumors about my supposed mental instability, even going so far as to bribe court officials to delay processes and lose important documents. Harold, on the other hand, oscillated between anger and pleading. One day he would send threatening letters through his lawyer. The next he would beg to see the children, promising everything would be different. But at no point did he admit the possibility that I was telling the truth about his father. The trial was set for March 1983. In the weeks leading up to it, I lived in a constant state of alert, fearing that Ernest or his men would try to find me, fearing for the children's safety, fearing that the judicial system, so often failing for women in my situation, would fail me too. On the eve of the trial, I received an unexpected call. It was Mrs. Eunice, Harold's aunt, and the principal of the school where Mom worked. We hadn't spoken since my escape from Millfield. "Betty," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." What she revealed in the hours that followed changed everything. Ernest, her brother-in-law, had abused her when she was young. That's why she never married, never had children. Fear and shame silenced her for decades. But upon learning of my case, upon hearing how Ernest continued to prey on women, she could no longer stay silent. "I will testify tomorrow," she said, determination evident in her voice. "It's too late for justice in my case, but not in yours." With Mrs. Eunice's testimony, added to Nancy's and the physical evidence I had kept, the case against Ernest gained strength. In court, despite his lawyer's attempts to discredit me, to paint me as a vindictive and mentally unstable wife, the truth prevailed. The judge, a younger man and less susceptible to Ernest's influence than many in Millfield, listened attentively to all testimonies. When it was my turn to speak, I told everything: the growing isolation, the veiled threats, the forced medication, and finally, the horror in the vestry after the baptism. The sentence came 2 weeks later. Ernest was found guilty of sexual assault and coercion, sentenced to 4 years in prison, although he served only 1, thanks to his lawyers and connections. Harold was not considered a direct accomplice, but lost custody of the children, receiving only the right to supervised visits after completing mandatory therapy. It was a victory, but not without cost. The process exposed intimate and painful details of my life, subjected me to humiliating interrogations, forced me to repeatedly relive the trauma. But it was worth it. For the first time in years, I felt I could breathe freely, that I could walk with my head held high, that I could sleep without fear. We decided not to return to Millfield. The memories were too painful, and Ernest's influence, even from prison, was still great. Instead, we started a new life in Nashville, FE. I found work as an assistant teacher at an elementary school, enrolled the children in nearby schools, and gradually, very gradually, we began to build a routine, a stability, a sense of normalcy that seemed impossible just months before. Rebuilding. The first years in Nashville were difficult. Despite the victory in court, there were 4 of us living on a modest assistant teacher's salary in a small apartment in the East End. The children felt the impact of the abrupt change, of the absence of their father, of new schools and friends. Gerald, especially as the oldest, carried a weight of responsibility that shouldn't have been a child's. Harold complied with the court orders. He went to therapy, attended supervised visits, paid, albeit irregularly, child support. Gradually, as he distanced himself from his father's toxic influence, he began to show signs of the man I had known and loved years before. In our brief conversations during visitation exchanges, I perceived his regret, his confusion, his internal struggle to reconcile the image he had of his father with the reality revealed in court. Ernest, after serving his reduced time in prison, disappeared from our lives. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he sold the transportation company and moved to another state, possibly to escape the public shame the case brought. He never tried to contact his grandchildren again, which was an enormous relief to all of us. In 1985, 3 years after our escape from Millfield, I received a proposal to teach at a larger school with better salary and benefits. It was the opportunity we needed to improve our financial situation and provide more comfort to the children, who were now 14, 12, and 10 years old. It was also during this period that I began to get involved with a support group for women victims of domestic and sexual violence. Initially, I went only as a participant, seeking healing for my own wounds. But soon I realized that my experience, both the trauma and the legal victory, could help other women in similar situations. I began to offer myself as a volunteer, first just for simple tasks like preparing coffee for meetings or distributing informational leaflets. Over time, I gained confidence to share my story and eventually to coordinate discussion groups and workshops on women's legal rights. This work brought me a sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. Each woman I could help, each small victory against a system that often protected abusers, was a step in my own healing. The children were also finding their ways. Gerald, always studious, stood out at school and talked about being a lawyer like Dr. Arliss, to help people like Mom. Helen, who had suffered nightmares for months after our escape, found comfort and strength in music, learning to play guitar and singing in the school choir. Matthew, our youngest, took longer to adapt, but eventually found joy in sports, especially basketball. In 1987, something unexpected happened. Harold, who had remained in Nashville to be close to the children, became seriously ill. A diagnosis of pancreatic cancer in an advanced stage gave him few months to live. Despite everything that had happened between us, I could not ignore the pain of a man who, despite his mistakes, was the father of my children. With the judge's permission, I took the children for unsupervised visits to the hospital, allowing them to spend quality time with their father in his last days. It was during one of these visits, while the children had gone out to buy a snack, that Harold asked me for forgiveness. With a weak voice and moist eyes, he confessed that he had realized, too late, his father's manipulation, that he deeply regretted not having believed me, not having protected his family when he should have. "I was blind, Betty," he said, holding my hand with fingers already fragile from the disease. Blind by a misdirected loyalty, by a false image of a man who didn't deserve my respect. Can I go in peace knowing that you forgive me? It wasn't easy. The wounds Harold had caused, his betrayal of the most basic trust between husband and wife, weren't something that could be erased with a few words. But I saw in his eyes a genuine regret, saw the man I had once loved before Ernest poisoned our relationship. "I forgive you, Harold," I finally said, "not for what you did, but for the man I know you could have been, for the father you are trying to be now." He passed away 2 weeks later, surrounded by his children and with a peace he hadn't shown in years. It was a bittersweet moment, sad for the loss of the father the children loved, but also a closure of a painful chapter in our lives. After Harold's death, I felt a strange freedom. There were no more supervised visits to coordinate, no more the weight of anger and resentment that, despite forgiveness, I still carried. We could truly start again. It was during this time that I made a decision that surprised even myself. We would return to Millfield. Not out of nostalgia or homesickness, but because, with Harold's death and Ernest's disappearance, there was nothing more to fear there. Besides, the cost of living was lower. I could be close to my aging parents, and the children could reconnect with their roots. The return wasn't easy. Millfield was a small town where gossip ran fast and memories were long. Many still remembered the scandal, the trial, the accusations against a man who was once respected in the community. There were sideways glances, whispers when we passed, doors that closed. But there were also those who welcomed us with open arms. Mrs. Zelda, whose courage in helping me when I most needed it, I never forgot. My parents, whose house was always a refuge of unconditional love. Former colleagues from the school where I taught, who now offered me a position back. We bought a small but comfortable house on Acacia Street, not far from my parents' house. The children, initially resistant to the idea of returning to the town they associated with painful memories, ended up adapting well. They found old friends, made new ones, and life began to gain a peaceful routine that we hadn't experienced in a long time. It was in Millfield, ironically in the same town where I suffered so much, that I found my greatest joy, working at the Women's House, a support center for women victims of violence that I helped found in 1990. Using the experience I gained in Nashville, along with some extraordinary women from the community, we created a space where women could find not only legal and psychological help, but also solidarity, understanding, and hope. The Women's House became my second home, my mission. Over the years, we helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships, seek justice against aggressors, rebuild their lives. Each success story was a victory not only for the woman in question, but for all of us who had gone through similar experiences. The children grew up, followed their paths. Gerald really became a lawyer, specializing in women's and children's rights, inspired by our story. Helen, with her musical talent, graduated in music and now teaches at the Millfield Conservatory. Matthew, always the most adventurous, moved to Nashville where he works as a civil engineer. In 2010, at 63 years old, I officially retired from teaching, but continued my work at the Women's House as a volunteer. It was also around this time that I discovered my passion for women's volleyball. I always liked sports, since the classes with Miss Gina at school, but never had much time to practice them or follow them during the difficult years of raising children and establishing a career. It all started when Helen invited me to watch a game of the American women's volleyball team on television. I was fascinated by the strength, determination, and teamwork of those women. Something about them, perhaps the way they overcame obstacles, how they got up after each fall, how they celebrated each victory together, resonated deeply with me. Since then, I don't miss a game. I have team t-shirts, I know the players by name, I follow national and international competitions. My friends joke that I'm the most fanatical grandma about volleyball in Millfield, and I accept the title with pride. Today, at 78 years old, I look back and see a life that, despite its pains and challenges, was well lived. I have 3 wonderful children, 6 adorable grandchildren, and the satisfaction of knowing that I helped make a positive difference in many women's lives. The pain never completely disappears. There are days when the memories return, when I still feel the weight of Ernest's hands, Harold's look of betrayal. But these moments are increasingly rare, increasingly distant. And when they come, I have my methods to drive them away. I turn on the television to watch volleyball. I call one of my children or grandchildren. I go to the women's house to see how I can help. Life goes on, and I learned that the best revenge against those who tried to destroy us is to live well, to live fully, to live with purpose and joy. Today, my routine today is peaceful and filled with small daily joys. I wake up early, around 5:30 in the morning, a habit I maintain from my teaching days. I prepare my coffee, strong and with a little cinnamon, the way I learned from my mother. Then I sit on the porch to watch the sunrise, give thanks for another day, and plan my activities. Mornings are usually dedicated to household chores. Even living alone since Harold passed, I like to keep the house immaculate. I sweep, dust, wash clothes, all with the tranquility of someone who is no longer in a hurry. Around 10 o'clock, when the heat starts to pick up, I turn on the television to watch sports programs. I have a small TV in the kitchen, so I can hear the volleyball news while preparing lunch. Oh, how excited I get when there's a game of the American team. On these occasions, my house becomes a meeting point. My daughter Helen, who lives here in Millfield, comes with her husband Jerome. Sometimes Matthew manages to get time off and comes from Nashville. Gerald, who lives in Louisville, is harder to appear on weekdays, but never misses important games. We make it a party, complete with popcorn, soda, and lots of cheering when our girls make a difficult point. My afternoons vary according to the day of the week. Mondays and Wednesdays I go to the women's house, where I still help with reception and initial counseling for women who arrive for the first time, frightened and disoriented as I once was. Tuesdays and Thursdays I attend the senior group at the community center. We do light gymnastics, play dominoes, talk about everything and nothing. It's an important moment of socialization, especially for someone my age. Fridays are special, lunch day with my longtime friends. We are 5 ladies, all in our 70s, who gather religiously at the Country Kitchen restaurant in downtown Millfield. Dorothy, my friend since childhood. Zoe, who moved to Millfield years after me. Gina, my former physical education teacher who is now an 85-year-old lady full of energy. And Nancy, yes, the same Nancy who courageously testified against Ernest all those years ago and who became a dear friend. In these gatherings, we talk about our families, share recipes, discuss politics. We're all quite opinionated, and inevitably reminisce about the old days. We laugh at old stories, sometimes cry remembering loved ones who have passed, but always leave with lighter hearts. Weekends are dedicated to family. Saturdays I usually receive Helen and her husband for lunch. Sometimes my 2 grandchildren through her also come, Theodore, 22, and Nadine, 18, when they're not busy with their youthful commitments. Sunday is the day to make the traditional fried chicken that my grandchildren love so much. If Matthew is in town, he always shows up, sometimes bringing his wife Olivia and my other 2 grandchildren, Elijah, 20, and Daisy, 15. When Gerald and his wife Harriet managed to come from Louisville with my twin grandchildren, Eugene and Dorothy, 14, the house is complete. These family lunches are my greatest joy. Seeing everyone together, talking, laughing, sharing news, makes my heart overflow with gratitude. In moments like these, I completely forget the pains of the past, the sleepless nights, the fear that was once my constant companion. My house on Acacia Street is simple but comfortable. It has 3 bedrooms, mine, one for the grandchildren when they stay overnight, and one that I turned into a small TV room, especially for watching volleyball games. The walls are decorated with family photos, some old ones in black and white, others colorful and recent. I have a spacious backyard in the back with some fruit trees that my father planted when I moved here, a cherry tree, a peach tree, and a lemon tree, which give me fruit all year round. Financially, I live with tranquility. I have my retirement as a teacher, Harold's pension, and a small savings that I managed to put together over the years. It's not much, but it's enough for a simple and dignified life. Occasionally, I do some text revision work to supplement my income, mainly for university students who need help with their theses. My health, thank God, has remained good for someone my age. I have a bit of high blood pressure, controlled with medication, and some joint pain that appears mainly on cold or rainy days. I take regular walks in the morning, before the sun gets too hot, and maintain a healthy diet, rich in fruits and vegetables. What impresses me most, looking back, is how I managed to transform suffering into strength, pain into purpose. The Women's House, which I helped found, has already served thousands of women throughout its 35 years of existence. Many arrived as I once arrived in Nashville, frightened, insecure, not knowing where to go or who to turn to. Seeing these same women, months or years later, strengthened, independent, owners of their own lives, is a reward that no money can buy. A few years ago, we started a special program at the Women's House, volleyball workshops for teenage girls from vulnerable neighborhoods. The idea arose when I realized how sports can be a powerful tool for self-knowledge and empowerment. In volleyball, as in life, we learn to fall and get up, to depend on each other, to celebrate small victories, to overcome defeats. The girls who participate in the workshops not only learn a sport, but also receive guidance about their rights, about healthy relationships, about how to recognize signs of abuse and seek help. When I watch the American team's games on television, with those strong and determined women, I think about how each of them overcame their own obstacles to get where they are. I also think about our workshop girls, and how some of them might one day reach these same stages. But more important than that, I think about how they are learning to be strong, independent, masters of their own destinies. If someone asked me what was the greatest lesson I learned in my 78 years of life, I would say it was the importance of having a voice, of speaking, even when fear tells us to stay silent, of denouncing, even when the system seems to be against us, of sharing our stories, even when they are painful, because it is through them that other women can find the courage to write different endings to their own stories. Ernest, the man who I once thought would destroy my life, ended up inadvertently giving me a purpose. Through the pain he caused, I found my mission to help other women, to fight for a world where stories like mine become increasingly rare. As for Harold, I learned to forgive him not only in his last hours of life, but truly in the years that followed. He too was, to some extent, a victim of Ernest's manipulation and control. Not that this justifies his choices or diminishes the pain he caused, but understanding this helped me make peace with the past and preserve the good memories of the first years of our marriage for our children. Today, when I look at my children and grandchildren, I feel immense pride. They grew up knowing parts of our family history, told gradually with care and sensitivity as their ages allowed. This awareness made them more empathetic people, more alert, more committed to justice. Gerald, with his work as a lawyer specializing in women's rights. Helen, who besides teaching music, volunteers in a project that uses art as therapy for traumatized children. Matthew, who even as an engineer, finds time to give talks about positive masculinity in schools and universities. Life, with all its unexpected turns, ended up leading me to a place of peace and purpose that I never imagined possible in my darkest moments. If I could say something to the young Betty, frightened and desperate in that dark vestry in 1982, it would be, "Hold on, my child. The pain won't last forever. Better days will come, and you will find strength you didn't know you had." My dears who are listening to me, if there's one thing I've learned on this long journey, it's that silence is the abuser's greatest ally. That dark vestry after my children's baptism could have been the end of my story, but I chose it to be just the beginning of a new one. I learned that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take it anymore. My experience taught me that our story doesn't end in the painful chapters. An abuse leaves invisible scars, but recovery shows that we can flourish even after the storm. Now, I need you to do something urgent, my dear, who is watching me. That subscribe button and the bell need to be activated right now. You can't imagine how important this is. Just as that tie clip was the proof I needed to prove the truth about the baptism, your support is the proof that stories like mine need to be told. Share this video immediately with all the women you know. Some of them might be living their own baptism day, a moment of abuse that she can't report. Your sharing could be the light that will guide her out of the dark vestry where she is trapped. And please, leave in the comments the word baptism so I know who really watched until the end and understood the importance of this message. Do this now. Don't wait even one more minute. Your action today could save a life tomorrow.